As Julie said, my name is Erin Hayden. I'm a pharmacist at Altman Hospital. So basically, I'm one of the vaccine coordinators for the hospital. I deal with the compliance and drug shortages. So the coronavirus has been quite a ride in the last year for us. So this will mostly focus on the vaccine. I know Julie had a lot of questions this week that were sent in. So I will try to address as many as I can that she had forwarded on to me. But if I don't get to your question, like Julie said, feel free to forward them on to her and I can answer them offline. So one disclaimer that I find very important to tell to everyone, that if you have any questions on whether or not you are eligible or whether or not you should receive the COVID-19 vaccine, if it's for you or not, please make sure you're checking with your physician beforehand. And I will stress this multiple times throughout the presentation. There are a lot of factors that go into the decision making. So I want to make sure everyone kind of understands what they need to ask their physician ahead of time. So this is hopefully a good guide for that. All right, so first off, what is coronavirus? So a lot of people kind of have this conception in their mind that the coronavirus is this disease that we're dealing with now, but it's actually something that we deal with every cold and flu season. It's fairly common. It's one of the things that we consider part of the common cold. So the coronavirus has been around for decades, if not centuries. Based off testing, they found possibly back to the 1960s, but it definitely probably close to centuries before that. So there are two types of coronavirus. These are the two that we primarily see most often. So we have the alpha and the beta. The alpha and the beta are really only for humans. So there are a few other strains, and I know that strains and variants have been passed around throughout the media lately, and we'll touch on that. But there are two different strains, alpha and beta, that we primarily see in humans. However, when we start to see things of pandemic proportions, we see things from mutations, and that happens from animal variants to humans. So there are two ways that that can happen. It can go directly from humans from the animal, or it can go through a secondary species. So COVID-19 derives possibly from bats. They've found similar types of the SARS-CoV-2 model in a certain species of bats. However, it could have jumped through a secondary species. And this is similar to MERS and SARS. So I'll touch on that in a little bit. But the origin of the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2 that we're currently dealing with, possibly originated from the Wuhan fish market. And the way that this happens when you see these mutations jump from animals to humans are when you see these mingling and crossbreeding of kind of literally flesh and blood of these animals, whether they're eating each other or humans are eating those animals. So at this Wuhan fish market, there's a lot of exotic animals who are butchered right there, and they're all butchered together. So this intermingling helps this virus kind of mutate and jump from the animals to the humans. One important thing to remember, and I'll touch on this with MERS and SARS, is that just because it jumps to a human doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to continue to reproduce in a human. So we did see this with MERS and SARS where they kind of fizzled out. So here's an ad from 2002 when SARS was the new epidemic. So H1N1, SARS-CoV, MERS, SARS-CoV-2, what we're currently dealing with. I talked about the 2002 SARS COVID virus, so not the one we're currently dealing with, but the one from 2002. This is one that kind of jumped to humans, but fizzled out. So only around 8,000 people infected and 800 deaths. It didn't evolve enough to become a persistent human pathogen like COVID-19 did. And then we had the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus, so MERS, also a type of coronavirus. Same thing, 2,500 people infected, around 900 deaths, and this was around 2012. And then you have our SARS-CoV-2, so COVID-19 of 2019. So when I did this health talk about 2 weeks ago, we had around 94 million people infected, and I just looked this morning to update these slides, and we're now at 107 million people infected worldwide with 2.4 million deaths. And then I'll explain why I included H1N1. on the next slide, but in 1918 and 2009, so the Spanish influenza in 1918, we had 500 million people infected and 50 million deaths. And then in 2009, 700 million people infected and 100,000 to 500,000 deaths. There's a lot of factors that played into inconsistencies of data reporting for the H1N virus in 2009. So those are kind of guesstimates. So we're looking at apples and oranges. How do we compare all of these different viruses? There's something called R naught. So it's this R with the 0. And it's a number that represents how quickly a contagious disease is spreading. So when we look at viruses, we look at transmissibility and then, of course, death rates or how severe they're infecting people. So this R naught is a good value to kind of compare apples to oranges. Now, granted, these 3 of these are all coronaviruses and different variants of them. So how do we compare them? The SARS and MERS, their R naught were anywhere from 1 to 2. So if a R naught value is equal to 1, it typically means that it's going to keep infecting people at a low rate. It's going to be persistent, but not outbreak level. If an R naught is greater than 1, so for example, the SARS-CoV-2, so COVID-19, that R naught value is actually close to 6. So to put in layman's terms, that basically means for every infected person, we're guessing around 6 other people would be infected from that person. Now, a lot plays into giving a good R naught value. There's a lot of variables. Variables that go into this are vaccination rates, masks, quarantining. If people are quarantining and there's vaccinating going on and masks are being worn, and all these precautions, then your R naught value is actually going to be lower than what it truly is. So the initial 6 that we see right now with COVID-19 actually could be much higher, considering that we have vaccination occurring, we have quarantining occurring, we're all wearing masks. All of that plays into the R naught value. And then the H1N1 virus of 1918 as well as 2009, same thing, they have an R naught value of around 1 to 2. So one thing I do want to compare, so 1918 Spanish influenza, so H1N1, and COVID-19. So you can see on the right here, I have a picture. This is, it looks like a gymnasium full of people during the Spanish influenza. And then here on the left, the same thing, except with COVID-19. So a lot of experts caution drawing parallels between the two. So there are certain parallels that we can draw, possibly that it comes in waves, that there are certain variants. And the biggest one that I think a lot of people draw from this is that in 1918, that H1N1 the variants that we see of the flu today are from the 1918 Spanish influenza. And Dr. Fauci kind of calls it the century of pandemics or century of outbreaks. We've had multiple influenza outbreaks. We saw some in the 50s and the 60s, again in the 80s and the 90s. Most notably last time was in 2009. So it's still with us today, 100 years later. And I think a lot of experts try to draw this parallel to COVID-19. And if we don't get this under control, we could possibly still see variants in the future. And I'll talk about variants here soon. So one thing that I do caution though, there are some drastic differences. So in 1918, we did not have a vaccine. In 1918, there was, disinfectants weren't really a thing. Even just personal hygiene is better now, as well as a lot of the complications that we see from COVID-19, we have the medications, we have the technology in the hospital to treat the complications from these viruses. Whereas in 1918, it was mostly supportive therapy. So it is a caution to not draw too many parallels, but also kind of going forward, just keep that in mind that we do have to do something so that we can move forward from this. All right. So looking at our COVID-19 timeline, I don't want to go into too much detail here, but there are a few really important points here on the timeline that I do want to touch base on. So December 2019, the Wuhan health commissioner had reported pneumonia cases, and it was a cluster of pneumonia cases that didn't quite follow the norm. So they decided to investigate it, and the novel coronavirus was identified. So that's an important thing. The identification of the molecule of the actual virus early on in the pandemic is important for the vaccine development. So you can see here the World Health Organization put their first release out to the community in January of 2020. First cases were recorded outside of Wuhan, China. And then the most important detail of all is that the genetic sequence of COVID-19 was shared after being found by researchers. We had our first confirmed case in the US on January 21st. Then looking towards the spring and the summer, it's declared a pandemic, travel restrictions were put into place, quarantining, authorization from the FDA. So the EUAs stands for emergency authorization. So multiple drugs were authorized by the FDA to use under emergency use. We see our death toll starting to rise. Our daily case counts start to increase drastically as we started to hit the fall. This is when we started to see our vaccines were starting to submit phase 1 and phase 2 data trial. And then we're looking at different other medications to actually treat the virus outside of the hospital started to get approved. And the one thing that I wanted to note here, in September of 2020, we're starting to hear about these variants and the contagious strains. The contagious strain that we currently see in the UK was actually discovered in September of 2020. So it's not as new as the media makes it sound. It was discovered quite early. And that comes into play when I start talking about variants in the vaccine. Our cases start to hit record numbers, 100,000 cases a day, antibody treatment. And then finally, our Pfizer and Moderna COVID-19 vaccines were granted EUA towards the end of 2020. So looking at here, the vaccine pipeline, in manufacturer terms, the pipeline is basically what's coming up. So on the left side of your screen on the red line, you'll see Moderna and Pfizer. So those two have been approved for emergency use, and those are the only two that have been approved in the US right now. They are mRNA vaccines, and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. One thing I wanted to note across the board, studying these different vaccines, the FDA only requires about 3,000 people to be in their phase 3 trials. And if you look there under the participant number of how many of these drug manufacturers had included in their trials, it's drastically much higher than 3,000, which is the minimum. So you're looking definitely above 30,000 people, which is really good. It gives us a good picture of what it's going to look like in the community and not just a very small number. So that's important to remember. For our ones that are FDA approved under emergency use, you have the efficacy there, and I'll talk about that as well. Some things to note with Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, Novavax, they do have some preliminary data coming out. So Johnson & Johnson hovers anywhere between 60 to 70% efficacy. And the one thing to note for them is that right now they're claiming to be a one-dose vaccine. AstraZeneca, they haven't officially published any phase 3 trial data in the US, but they're also hovering anywhere between 70 to 80%. And then Novavax, which is the new player in the game, it's a different type of vaccine. It's not a mRNA, it's not a viral vector. It actually uses nanoparticles. So it's a protein subunit vaccine. And what that means is it uses this trademarked matrix M. So that is Novavax patented technology. It's called matrix M. And they extract it from certain molecules, and it basically is a nanoparticle that will carry antigens from the spike protein. So kind of similar to an mRNA vaccine, but not quite. And so for Novavax's efficacy, they're hovering around 90% at a 2-dose series. So right now, Johnson & Johnson has submitted to the FDA to get approved. We're hoping to see something from the FDA towards the end of this month. So hopefully in the next few weeks, we will see either an emergency use authorization approved or denied for Johnson & Johnson. And then Novavax should hopefully be starting to submit their phase 3 trial data as well as AstraZeneca. All right. So this was one that I added. If you had seen my previous health talk, I wanted to add about the variants because this is what's blowing up all over the news. So the vaccines don't work against the variants. This is a misconception. It's not a yes or no thing, but there's some data to support that they still work. So do the vaccines work against the variants? So Moderna and Pfizer, remember those are our two that are currently approved, have both released data suggesting their vaccines retain neutralizing activity. So what does that mean? That means that they're still going to produce an antibody effect and help your body fight off the virus, but it might not be as big. So Moderna at the end of January actually released some data that showed no difference in the titers and the antibodies that help protect your body and help your body fight off the virus to the UK variant, so the one that's currently going through the UK. However, it showed a 6-fold decrease in titers or antibodies to the South Africa virus. And that kind of seems dramatic and that kind of seems worrisome, but they were still above the considered level that we say it's still protective. So even though it was 6-fold decreased, it still is protective. It's considered at a protective level for the South African variant. So that variant, and that's very good news. With Pfizer, same thing as well. So they did in vitro studies and it showed a lower rate, same thing for the South African variant, but they felt that it was such a small difference that it would have no long-term effects on the vaccine's efficacy. So that is good news coming out, but we do kind of want to take this with a grain of salt. What they've studied this on is fairly small study groups. So we'd obviously like to see it kind of grow and then continue to look at this. The good news is that both companies already have booster doses in testing, and they are saying that it would hopefully be very quick. The only holdup that may come from that is something like the FDA and regulatory restrictions. One that we've most often seen in the news lately is AstraZeneca. So looking at the study that was done in South Africa, South African scientists had found that the AstraZeneca vaccine did not prevent mild or moderate disease of the South African variant. So that sounds very bad and kind of scary. But one thing that I really want people to keep in mind is that our goal is to reduce hospitalization, severe cases, and deaths. If this ends up turning into something where we can get vaccinated and it's just a mild cold, it's still 100 times better than what we're currently dealing with. So, this data that's coming out about the variants, it's good to listen to it and to take it into account. But what they're seeing right now is it's still promising to protect people against severe disease. And AstraZeneca is continuing their study in South Africa. I know South African government has asked to stop the rollout of AstraZeneca in South Africa, but their scientists have started to take another look at it. And as long as it will prevent their severe disease, deaths, and hospitalizations, they will still go forward with it. So that's something to keep in mind. Can you still receive the COVID vaccine after having COVID? Absolutely, yes. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, so the CDC, states that patient can defer the vaccine until 90 days from the infection. So why 90 days? So this is really just a recommendation, and it is more of a if you wish to defer. But basically what happens when you either get the virus or the vaccine, you're going to see here on that darker blue curve, you have your asymptomatic stage where it's incubating. You start getting your symptoms, and then something called IgM becomes detectable. IgM is our short-term antibody. So that means that it's not going to stay very long in our body, maybe around 14 days, and then it kind of typically disappears. So that is a measure of our acute infection. We see the peak of the virus where symptoms are at their worst, and then the patient begins to recover. During that recovery, we start to see that IgG production begins. That is our long-term antibodies. And this is that lighter blue curve that kind of goes on and kind of starts to peak at 28 days, and that's what provides our long-term antibodies. So when you have this 90-day recommendation from the CDC, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's any data to support it. 90 days is kind of arbitrary. The reason they kind of suggest it is that you have your lowest chance of reinfection within 90 days. But one thing to really remember especially as this continues to roll out, the vaccine is not as available as everyone would like it to be. So if you are only 30 days out from your infection, you can still get the vaccine. And it's important to remember that if you maybe don't take it at that time that it's offered, it may not be available again, or you may have to get back in line. So those are really important considerations that you should talk to your doctor about and make sure that you're ready to get the vaccine when it's offered to you if you're within that 90-day window. And then this is also a good picture. I've had a lot of questions about what to expect with your second dose, and am I going to feel not so good after my second dose? So what happens when you get your vaccine is very similar to what happens when you have the infection. You're going to get these long-term antibodies as well as short-term antibodies. So when we get our second dose, we're around 21 or 28 days, depending on which vaccine you've gotten. So you have these antibodies starting to produce in your body. And you can see on this chart right here, days from infection. So 28 days, that's when your long-term antibodies are really starting to ramp up. So the reason that we see some symptoms with our second dose are because of these antibodies. Your body has kind of programmed itself to have this response to when that virus enters your body, which is a very good sign that the vaccine is working and that your body is hopefully going to be protected. So with your second dose, you can expect some mild side effects. So headache, some fever, some chills. I can tell you with my second dose, I really just had a headache, but some other people had the fever and the chills, but it typically dissipates within 24 hours. So that is one thing I wanted to answer because a lot of people had questions about what to expect with their second dose. So COVID-19 and antibodies. So like I said, your lowest chance of reinfection is within 90 days. The biggest thing is that you want to make sure you're no longer actively ill and that you're removed from isolation. So, you want to ideally wait around 14 days from your acute illness. So you're recovering, you're feeling better, you're removed from isolation, you're not having any severe symptoms, you're definitely out of the hospital if you were hospitalized, stuff like that. The one thing that you do want to wait 90 days for is if, while maybe you were hospitalized or not, you had received antibody therapy for COVID-19 treatment. So the two drugs you may hear of are bamlanivimab or Regeneron. So the Regeneron product you can see there, right now it's still in its trial name. It doesn't have an official name, so it's a bunch of numbers. But the recommendation is a little bit more firm to wait 90 days if you do receive those. And that's mostly because they don't know how those passive antibodies that are put into your body will react with the vaccine. And the 90 days kind of ensures that most of that antibody is gone from your body. And one important thing to note, if you get treatment with IVIG or RhoGAM or anything like that, that's not included in that 90 days. If you're getting treatment, antibody treatment for something else, that's not included in that 90 days. All right. The consent form asks a lot of questions. If I have any of those conditions, or if I mark yes to any of those questions, can I not get the vaccine? This is myth. You may still qualify to receive the vaccine. And this is why, checking this stuff beforehand and talking to your physician before you get your shot is so important. So this is just a generic CDC checklist that you may see and answer some questions before you get your vaccine. So the first question on there is, are you feeling sick today? So there's no evidence that supports receiving a vaccine while sick will reduce the efficacy or any type of safety issues, but it is recommended to delay it until you're no longer sick. So just like I said, while with COVID, you want to be outside that acute phase of the illness. You're recovering, you're on the mend, you're feeling much better. And like I said, with COVID patients, ideally you want to wait until about 14 days after your acute illness is over and you're removed from isolation. One thing I do want to note, and it's a common misconception that we get questions about a lot, is if you're mildly ill or you're on antibiotics or you're on steroids, it does not disqualify you from receiving the vaccine. Still talk to your physician beforehand and check that they agree that you should receive the vaccine at that time. But if you just have kind of an upset stomach, maybe you're having a migraine that day, maybe you have a very, very mild, like maybe a sinus infection and you're on antibiotics, that type of stuff should not disqualify you from receiving the vaccine at that time. So make sure you're definitely checking with your physician. So I'm going to kind of group all of these allergic reaction questions together. So have you ever had an allergic reaction to, so you can see here, components of the COVID-19 vaccine. So the biggest one that you'll see is PEG, or polyethylene glycol, polysorbate, a previous dose, so maybe you're on your second dose. Have you ever had an allergic reaction to another vaccine? So maybe 30 years ago, you had a reaction to a flu vaccine, or maybe you've had a bad reaction when you went in for surgery and you had something to an antibiotic or anything like that. So all these allergic questions all together. So polyethylene glycol, it's found in laxative, cosmetics. It's basically a thickener. It's something that's used to hold things together. And it is in the 2 mRNA vaccines. So the CDC's recommendation is that if you have a severe allergy to the polyethylene glycol or polysorbate or any different component that is listed there on the screen, it is a contraindication to receiving the vaccine. So this is a really important conversation to have with your physician beforehand, especially if you know that you have a lot of allergies. You can always check with your allergist or immunologist. However, the biggest thing to note here is that if you have allergies to other vaccines, other IVs, other oral medications, pets, environmental allergens, venoms, it is not a contraindication. This is where you will definitely have a conversation with your physician. So I'm going to move on here because I have a better picture to show you guys. If I have a lot of allergies, am I able to receive the vaccine still? Yes. So those are the ones that I listed as a contraindication. But this is a really nice chart here that the CDC provides. A majority of the public is going to fall into this, this green allergy column. So maybe you have a history of, you're allergic to penicillin, or you maybe are allergic to cats, anything like that. You can see here that the CDC still recommends that you get the vaccine, and you're in the green category. What we may do for you if you come in is that you may stay with us for 30 minutes instead of 15 minutes, and we make sure everything's good to go. If you start to fall into the yellow category, this is where you really want to have that conversation with your physician, and you and your physician will talk about a risk versus benefit. Is it better for you to get the vaccine and possibly risk an allergic reaction, or should you not get the vaccine? So this is definitely, like I said, take a look at this. If you have allergies, I really just, I want everyone to know that you should be checking with your physician beforehand, because we don't want you to be in line to get your vaccine and you say, I'm allergic, I had an allergic reaction to the flu shot 10 years ago. This is stuff that we want to make sure is taken care of ahead of time. So the next one on the screening question, have you received a vaccine in the last 14 days? So right now they're recommending that you space vaccine out 14 days from your COVID-19 vaccine. A big point to remember here, and everyone seems to forget about it, is that you have a second dose. So I had a few people who got their COVID-19 vaccine. They went the next week and they got their first dose of their Shingrix, but then they were due 7 days later for their second dose of their Pfizer vaccine. And you have to try and space them out 14 days. It's not necessarily a direct contraindication if your physician needs you to get another vaccine. Maybe you're a healthcare worker, maybe you're in a long-term care facility and you need something like the flu vaccine. This is where you would have another conversation with your physician. Have you ever had a positive test for COVID-19? Or has a doctor ever told you that you had COVID-19? So we already discussed this. It's not a direct contraindication to receiving the vaccine. If you wish, you could defer your 90 days. Otherwise, you can have a conversation with your physician, and if they think you're recovered enough, you can receive the vaccine. And then, have you ever received passive antibody therapy? So again, this is the same thing. That's the 90-day recommendation. That's a little bit more firm on that recommendation. So if you have received that, make sure you're talking to your physician. And then these next two, I'll talk about on the next slide. So weakened immune systems or bleeding disorder. So CDC recommendation for immunosuppression. So your immune response, your immune system doesn't have as large of a response because it's suppressed for whatever reason. There is multiple different disease states that can cause that: HIV, cancer, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis. And a lot of times it's the medications that are treating those that kind of cause that immunosuppression, but sometimes it's also the condition. But those patients also have a higher risk of getting COVID-19 and a higher risk of having a more severe case because their immune system cannot fight off the virus. So the CDC recommends vaccination for those who have immunocompromising conditions or treatment. The really important thing to remember here is that the CDC recommends talking to your physician about timing of treatment with your vaccine. So some immunologists and allergists kind of recommend making sure that maybe you get the vaccine before your next treatment so that your immune system isn't as suppressed. And same with oncologists. So make sure if you see those specialists for any type of condition that you have, that you're checking with them and asking them, how should I time this with my treatment? And then for blood disorders and thinners, this was a big question for a lot of the people that we've seen come through, because the reason it's on that questionnaire is not necessarily that it is going to, cause disruption with your blood disorder or the blood thinners that you're on, but it's actually just because you're getting an injection. And for those of you who have a blood disorder or on blood thinners, you know that you may bruise easier, you may bleed a little easier. So it's really just making sure and checking with your physician, hey, am I stable enough to receive an injection that may cause some bleeding? All right. And the last one that you'll see on a lot of the forms is, are you pregnant or breastfeeding? So one thing that I really want to touch base here on the pregnancy and lactation, and I'll touch on it with the infertility as well. There's no safety data for or against receiving the vaccine for pregnant or lactating women. But the one important thing that I want people to realize is that we shouldn't pass judgment on pregnant women for taking the vaccine if they choose to. It's a decision that is for them to make with their physician. So looking here, studies have shown that pregnant women have a higher risk of severe infection, and they tend to have a higher risk of mortality if they end up having that severe infection. So it is really a risk for pregnant women to get the COVID-19 infection. There are two societies that kind of guide the recommendation on vaccines for pregnant women. So the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine. So they essentially recommend that a risk versus benefit analysis be completed. So you can see there the 4 things that they recommend that the physicians talk about with their patients and make an informed decision on. The Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine advocates for pregnant and lactating women to be included in continuing COVID-19 vaccine trials. So that is one thing that these societies really advocate for women to be included in these trials so that we may know that they are safe for them. Typically, pregnant women are excluded from most clinical trials, if not all. So their reasoning for that is that recently an Ebola vaccine that works similar to AstraZeneca's viral vector COVID-19 vaccine, it's been given in pregnant women, and it has shown that it is safe and effective. Will the COVID-19 vaccine change my DNA? So I know this one was floating around a lot in the media initially. So this is a myth. The vaccine cannot change your DNA, and I'll talk a little bit why that is. So the 2 vaccines that we currently have out now are the mRNA technology. So what is mRNA? It's messenger RNA. So basically, to put it in layman's terms, that mRNA is a set of instructions for your body. When that enters your body, it tells your body what to do. So it's the genetic code from the nucleus. And if you think way back to maybe a biology class that you took, the nucleus is kind of the brain of the cell. So all of the DNA, all of the genetic material, all that genetic code, it's kind of stored inside of there. So the mRNA transfers that from the nucleus to the outside area so that there's direction. So basically what happens here and why it's called technology is that it uses genetic sequencing on types of diseases. So I talked about that genetic sequencing early on in the COVID-19 pandemic. They found that genetic sequence and they were able to take part of the spike protein. So you can see that here in that bottom picture. There's a spike protein that makes the virus kind of look like the pictures you see online. And the COVID-19 vaccine takes part of that and replicates that. So here's a better picture of what happens here. So you can see what happens here is that in the bottom left corner, you see the spikes. So that spike protein, the mRNA is taken, it's injected into your body. And what happens is that mRNA of the vaccine goes inside of your cell. It does not enter the nucleus. So you can see that purple circle right there in the middle where your DNA is. It never enters the nucleus of your cell. And it stays outside there where it starts to replicate and help your body fight off the virus. So there's your DNA in the center there, and you can see the mRNA never enters the nucleus of the cell. So this was a request that Dr. Lee Merritt, I've seen this video kind of floating around online, and I just wanted to briefly address some of the claims that she puts in her video. So her claim is that vaccines will not fix our problem and that there are other things like hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine that we saw in the beginning of the pandemic that are good for prevention as well as treatment. So there are, as well as vitamin D. So a lot of these claims are, her claims are not really supported by any studies. If anything, they're refuted by very large studies that were done at multiple centers. So the FDA had initially approved hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine as treatment for COVID-19. However, multiple large-scale studies have been completed and they've shown no benefit in treatment, no difference in hospitalization as well as death. And then things like correlation to vitamin D levels and ICU stays. Again, there's not really any data that suggests that this is true. She tends to draw some correlation between the two, but there's no data that suggests that having increased vitamin D levels would keep you out of the ICU stay. So looking at this, I'll talk about why vaccines are better than passive or immunity that we may get from having the infection, but the vaccines right now are a good option to start to fight this virus and move forward. So I know this one had been floating around on the internet, and I know we had a few requests for me to touch base on Dr. Lee Merritt's YouTube video that she had posted. So I want people to keep in mind that a lot of this that we are seeing is driven by science and large center studies. So we want to make sure that we are keeping up with the CDC recommendations and hopefully not seeing too many different claims out there. My friend tested positive after receiving the vaccine. They must have gotten COVID from the vaccine. So this is a myth. You cannot get COVID from the COVID-19 vaccine. So you may experience symptoms. I had said this before. It could be with your first or your second shot. Most people see it with their second shot, but if you did have COVID, like I said, you're going to have those antibodies. So when you get your first shot, you may see some mild symptoms. However, symptoms on average for both Pfizer and Moderna dissipated within 72 hours or 3 days. So it may be asked, well, how did they test positive after getting the vaccine? It's likely they were incubating the virus prior to getting the vaccine. Or the other thing is that they had not had enough time. It takes about 14 days, as you saw, for those antibodies to start to produce. So maybe enough time had not passed to boost their immunity to fight off the infection. And then the vaccine will not cause a positive COVID-19 test. There's two types of tests. So there's nucleic acid amplification or an antigen test. For either of the two tests that are currently used, it will not cause a positive test. The only thing that you may see a positive test for is a positive antibody test, and we would expect this, and this is a good thing. This is similar to getting your titers checked maybe for like an MMR or a hepatitis B. You're testing that you have the antibodies. So you may get a positive antibody test after getting the vaccine, but that's a good thing. And one thing I did want to touch about the positive antibody test, it's not recommended that you say you get your vaccine, you get your second dose, and in 2 months you go get your antibodies drawn to see if your vaccine's working. It's not necessarily recommended to do that, purely because right now the antibody tests are, they have a very high rate of inaccuracy. So only about 30% of the time are they going to actually detect antibodies in the blood. Does COVID-19 vaccine cause infertility? So this is a misconception. So before I start talking about this, I do want to just kind of touch base that there is no data to support this either way, but kind of I want to talk about where this claim came from. So the claim came from someone named Wolfgang Wodarg. So he had requested basically to the European Medicines Agency, kind of like our FDA, to postpone the study and approval of the Pfizer vaccine. And basically why he wanted to do that was that he had claimed that there is a protein that has a similar genetic makeup to the spike protein of the virus. And so if the body is trained to attack that spike protein, it may attack that protein that's in the placenta. So another thing to note is that Wodarg had actually spoken out against vaccinations and other pandemics. So the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, he had asked the same thing of the European Medicines Agency to stop the production of the H1N1 vaccine in 2009. So in response to Wodarg, experts had looked at his claim, and they claim that it is a very, very small stretch of genetic material that they share. And they kind of equate this to having the one number in a phone number the same as someone else. So if my phone number starts with 7 and someone else's phone number starts with 7, but then all of the other numbers are different, that's how small of a similarity they have. So they expect it not to occur. And of course, this is all kind of theoretical. No data to support his claim. And he himself had actually stated that there's no indication of whether the antibodies against spike proteins would also act like the protein that's in the placental development antibodies. So this is really important to remember that this was a claim, it's theoretical, there's no data to support it. So pregnant women were excluded from the study, as I said before, but something interesting that I found was that so they were tested before the study to make sure they weren't pregnant, because pregnant women are excluded from the study, but a percentage of women became pregnant during the study that had received the vaccine. Another really important thing to remember is that the clinical definition of infertility is actually 2 years of not having a child and trying. So, this has only been studied for around 6 months in these studies. So it's really important to remember that as well. And one point that I also found interesting that an expert had brought up was that 20% confirmed by testing of the population has been infected, although they suspect it's almost 3 times higher than that haven't been tested and that were infected. But they have found no difference in fertility patterns in the US and worldwide. If I get vaccinated, I don't have to wear a mask anymore. This is a misconception. So when you're looking at how well these vaccines work, I talked about how many participants these studies have. But the thing to remember here when you're looking at how they were studied was that the primary endpoint, so what they studied, was that you had to have a symptom and a positive test. So what does that mean for wearing a mask? It basically means that the studies did not evaluate asymptomatic spread. So say 2 people in your family are vaccinated, they could still carry the virus and give it to you who may be unvaccinated, because it could be asymptomatic spread. So they may not know they're carrying it. And it's an assumption because they didn't look at it in the studies and it's not known for sure. So this is why masks still need to be worn. These vaccines were developed quickly, they can't be safe. This is a misconception. So you can see here, this is a typical vaccine timeline. And you can see here from 2020 to 2036, so anywhere from 10 to 14 years it could take to make a vaccine. What they do is they basically squish that timeline down. So here's a really good picture as well of vaccine development. You have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. But the really important thing for the COVID-19 vaccine was that there was a lot of collaboration and a lot of money put into this. So this really helps shrink it down to less than a year. But the biggest piece of it, remember when I said way back in January that they had the genetic sequence. This was the key piece to having this vaccine as quickly as we did. Having that genetic sequence, having scientists collaborate with one another, whether they're from the same country, whether they speak the same language, and having governments kind of put this money towards, saving their countries with the vaccine, was the key player to getting this vaccine out as quick as we did. And then obviously they did shorten the clinical trials. Phase 1 and phase 2 trials were only, a month or two, and phase 3 trials were only a couple of months, whereas typically you see phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials lasting anywhere from 1 to 3 years. So things were shortened, but there were a lot of key components in the development of this vaccine that really helped get it out quickly. So looking at safety profiles, so again, I want to stress the minimum for a phase 3 trial is 3,000 participants, and these had over 10 times that. So for the Pfizer, the most common side effect was an injection site reaction. So basically a sore arm, maybe some redness, maybe some itching. And then on your second dose, that's when you may expect some fatigue or a headache, as well as the muscle pain. And then Moderna safety profile. So again, over 30,000 participants. The biggest reaction was pain at the injection site and some fatigue. So again, with that second dose, you may see a little bit more mild reaction with headache, chills, things like that. And then, so you can see their local and systemic reactions were more common with dose 2 versus dose 1. And most of the time they were reported within 2 to 3 days of that vaccine. I'm young, getting COVID won't be too bad. I'll have natural immunity and I'm not high risk. So this is a myth. While most deaths occur in the elderly population, there can be long-lasting health effects. So natural immunity may provide more immunity than some vaccines. But as we start to develop these vaccines better and better, we're actually seeing it's quite the opposite. The vaccines tend to provide a little bit more coverage than natural immunity. And the other thing you have to have a concern with is safety. So having the vaccine instead of getting the infection reduces the risk of long-term health conditions and hospitalization. So like I said, as these vaccines start to develop, so with varicella, the vaccine was introduced in 1995, hospitalizations and deaths decreased by greater than 90%. So that's quite the difference. Long-term health conditions from COVID-19, so respiratory failure, scarred lungs. They're seeing a lot of difficulty thinking and concentration with mood disorders, heart palpitations, kidney failure. So these are a lot of different things that we may see long-lasting effects from having COVID-19. And then, of course, the costs and the toll of the healthcare system. The average for someone who's around 40 years old, 20 to 40 years old, the average cost could be anywhere from $40,000 to $50,000 for a COVID-19 hospital stay. And there's been studies looking at how this is going to affect our healthcare system going forward. And for commercial payers, so if you're not on Medicare or Medicaid, commercial payers, they're looking at an increased cost of over $6 billion just for COVID-19. And then for Medicare, you're looking over anywhere from $3 to $6 billion in Medicare. So this is a huge toll on our healthcare system, not only with cost, but also resources and then healthcare workers themselves. So some quick facts. Can you get another manufacturer for your second dose? As of now, the FDA only has approved same manufacturer for first and second doses. However, the CDC has come out with recommendations saying if you cannot confirm what you had for your first dose, say you went to a different site, you don't remember, then they recommend that you just get whatever vaccine is available for your second dose as of now. But these recommendations change almost weekly, so please try and keep up with the CDC's COVID-19 vaccine page. Is one dose enough immunity? So You saw there some efficacy after the first dose with Pfizer was about 50%, whereas with Moderna, it's somewhere around 90 to 92%. But one thing we want to remember is that in the studies, it wasn't the people who only got one dose were not followed. So we don't know the long-term effects, if they had longer immunity, if they actually kept that 92% after their first dose. So currently the recommendation is to continue with the 2-dose series for the currently approved vaccines. Say you're not available at the time they specify. So right now there's a window of plus or minus 4 days from your due date. However, just last week, the CDC had updated the guideline to up to 6 weeks from your first dose, so up to 42 days from your first dose. However, if you miss that 42-day window or the 4-day window, whatever it may be, it's not recommended to get an additional shot. You should just get your second shot and that's it. So a lot of questions on why we're choosing only certain people to get the vaccine right now. So the government has analyzed the highest risk population and populations with the higher death rate. So that's why we started with healthcare workers and then moved on to our 80 plus, 70 plus, and so on. So who will the vaccine be available through? Health departments, physician offices, hospitals, rural health centers, federally qualified health centers, and pharmacies. Right now, through Ohio, so through ODH, they are targeting health departments, hospitals, and pharmacies right now. Within, hopefully, we will start to see it start to go out to the physician offices as well. So this is a really big question. Where can I find the vaccine? ODH has a great website. It's vaccine.coronavirus.ohio.gov. I'll kind of pause for a minute if you would like to write this down. When you go to this website, it's going to, at the top of the page, list everyone's who is in the eligible groups to get the vaccine. And then I took a screenshot here. You can see it shows a map. You can search by zip code, you can search by county, and you can see all the different administration locations and find one nearest to you. It should list a phone number or some type of contact information so that you can reach out to them, see if you're able to get on the list, see if you're eligible. So again, vaccine.coronavirus.ohio.gov. Make sure you're taking a look at this. And it is updated continually. ODH is starting to add more sites. So you can't see it really here on the screenshot, but up in the corner at the map, it'll show you the last day that it was updated. So again, it'll show health departments, physician offices, hospitals, rural health centers, federally qualified health centers, and pharmacies. So I'll just pause for one more second, make sure everyone got that wrote down. And you can always search it in Google and type in Ohio COVID-19 vaccine administration locations if you cannot find that website.